When someone realizes they no longer have control over you, something interesting happens. It's almost as if their whole identity, which was built around influence, starts to tremble. You see, people who own control are deeply invested in the idea that they can shape the world, or at least your world, according to their will. They have spent time, energy, and often emotion trying to create patterns where you respond predictably to their cues. When that predictability disappears, when you begin to stand firm in your own choices, the effect on them is immediate and visceral. They feel exposed, unsure, and alarmingly powerless. And that's when the subtle manipulation begins. It's never dramatic at first. It's not always loud or obvious. In fact, the most effective tactics are the ones you almost don't notice at all. A casual comment, a fleeting look, a tone that seems just slightly off. It's designed to make you pause. It's designed to make you question your reality. They want you to wonder if maybe you've misread the situation, if perhaps you've misunderstood their intentions, if maybe you've overreacted. This is not an accident. This is the final, quiet, and incredibly precise effort to regain influence over your mind. They will plant doubt in ways that seem innocent, a compliment that carries a hidden barb, a remark about your decisions that is phrased as concern. Even silence can become a weapon. The absence of attention or acknowledgement is used to make you feel off balance, to pull you back into a state where you're scanning for approval, scanning for signs that you might have done something wrong. It's like a psychological chess move. They are carefully nudging you back into dependence on their validation, hoping that one misstep on your part will pull you into their orbit again. And here's the thing. It's effective because it preys on something human and universal, the natural desire to make sense of social dynamics and preserve harmony. Our brains are wired to interpret signals, to read the room, and to respond to relational cues. So when someone who used to have influence over us starts acting differently, be it subtly critical, mysteriously distant, or oddly attentive, it triggers an internal alarm. It nudges us to rethink, to analyze, to question, and that's exactly what they want. It's a psychological trap, disguised as normal interaction. The manipulation often escalates in subtle waves. At first it's small, almost imperceptible, but if they sense that you are still steady, still resistant to their influence, they may increase the intensity of the tactics. They might begin to mix messages, one moment warm, the next moment distant, one moment complimenting, the next moment criticizing, one moment casual, the next moment emotionally loaded. This push and pull is exhausting if you're not aware of it, because it bypasses logic and taps straight into instinctive emotional reactions. It's designed to create confusion, to destabilize your sense of certainty, and to make you seek clarity in their eyes or their words. What's remarkable, though, is that all of this is completely unnecessary for someone who is truly self-aware. When you recognize that these behaviors are not random, when you understand that the goal is not communication but control, the dynamic shifts entirely. Awareness is the antidote. Once you understand that the casual comments, the subtle jabs, the inconsistent attention, they are all tools designed to manipulate your perception, you immediately disarm them. Their power exists only as long as you allow yourself to be manipulated. The second you step back and observe the behavior as a tactic, rather than a personal attack, you remove their leverage. It's also fascinating how these manipulative behaviors are rooted in fear. They are born from the fear of losing relevance, of no longer being able to influence the narrative or your choices. Someone who is used to control often cannot tolerate the idea of being powerless. That fear drives the subtlety and the persistence of the tactics. It's not about you, it's about their inability to handle the fact that you are autonomous, that you can think, feel, and act independently without reference to them. Understanding this is liberating because it reframes the interaction. You no longer interpret their behavior as a reflection of your inadequacy. Instead, you see it as a reflection of their insecurity. This is why self-awareness and emotional grounding are so essential. When you cultivate clarity about your own values, decisions, and boundaries, the subtle manipulation loses its edge. You begin to see patterns instead of incidents, strategies instead of accident. Every ambiguous comment, Every mixed signal, every attempt to unsettle you, is just another reminder that you are free from their control. The realization that their influence is no longer operative gives you a sense of empowerment that cannot be undermined by fleeting attempts at confusion or doubt. Even more, it changes the way you interact with them. You no longer react impulsively, you no longer seek approval or validation. You respond deliberately, with intention, or sometimes not at all, and that is what frustrates them the most. The subtle manipulations, the tiny tactics designed to shake your confidence, cannot penetrate a mind that has learned to observe rather than absorb. The more grounded and self-aware you become, the more ineffective these strategies are. And the irony is that by recognizing their methods, you also gain insight into human behavior at large. You understand not only their tactics, but also the mechanisms of influence, control, and emotional manipulation, which makes you stronger in every area of life. This moment, the moment you fully recognize their last-ditch attempts to regain control, is also a turning point. It is the moment when you step fully into your own authority, when you realize that external attempts to influence you cannot alter your trajectory unless you allow them to. The subtle tactics, the confusion, the mixed signals, they are no longer threats. They are merely indicators that you are moving in the right direction, away from dependency and toward freedom, autonomy, and self-possession. The moment you realize that emotional detachment is the key to neutralizing manipulation is when everything begins to shift in your favor. So often people fall into the trap of thinking that reacting emotionally is a measure of strength or authenticity, but the truth is, emotional reactions are exactly what manipulators depend on. They thrive when you respond with anger, guilt, confusion, or even self-doubt. Every flicker of frustration, every hesitating pause, every instinctive defense is fuel for them, reinforcing the illusion that they still hold power. The reality is that their power is never inherent. It exists only as long as you allow yourself to participate in their game. Emotional detachment doesn't mean you stop feeling. It doesn't mean you become cold or unfeeling. It means that you develop the ability to observe, to see the behavior for what it truly is, and to respond with intention rather than instinct. It's about creating a mental and emotional space between their actions and your reaction. It's about understanding that their behavior is a reflection of their own insecurities, their fear of losing influence, and their dependence on control, not a reflection of your value, your worth, or your reality. When you achieve that awareness, you immediately strip them of leverage, because manipulation only works when the target is emotionally entangled. This detachment is a skill, and like any skill, it requires practice. It starts with awareness, noticing the patterns of manipulation without immediately judging or internalizing them. When someone throws a subtle barb or sends a confusing signal, you pause and ask yourself, is this about me, or is this about them? Most of the time it's about them, their fear, their insecurity, their need to feel relevant in a space where they no longer control the narrative. By reframing it this way, you no longer respond from a place of reactivity, you respond from a place of strategy, clarity, and self-possession. The power of emotional detachment is that it removes the drama from the interaction. You begin to see the tactics for what they are, attempts to destabilize, to provoke, to create dependency, and once you see it, the entire dynamic changes. You no longer feel the pressure to defend yourself, to explain yourself, or to justify your decisions. You recognize that their attempts at control are irrelevant to your life unless you let them matter. You realize that your emotional state, your sense of confidence, and your decisions belong to you alone, not to someone trying to manipulate your perception or behavior. Detachment also allows you to maintain your boundaries with clarity and consistency. When you are emotionally invested in the manipulation, boundaries can feel like a battleground. They become something to negotiate, defend, or justify. But when you are detached, boundaries are no longer a fight. They are simply a reflection of your values and your stand. You enforce them calmly, consistently, and without drama, and in doing so you communicate power and self-respect more effectively than any argument or confrontation ever could. This is the kind of power that leaves manipulators frustrated, because they cannot shake it with confusion, guilt, or emotional provocation. Another remarkable aspect of emotional detachment is that it transforms your own sense of freedom. When you stop reacting to attempts at control, you reclaim space in your mind and in your life. You no longer have to expend energy analyzing every comment, every gesture, every silence. You stop replaying interactions, wondering what you should have said, how you should have acted, or whether you misunderstood. That energy once hijacked by someone else's need to manipulate is now entirely yours. You can use it to make decisions, pursue goals, and cultivate relationships that align with your values, rather than someone else's agenda. Detachment also creates a subtle but profound shift in perception. You begin to see the difference between influence and manipulation, between genuine concern and control, between authentic connection and emotional leverage. You start to recognize patterns not just in one person, but in multiple relationships, which equips you with an incredible sense of discernment. You no longer fall into the trap of trying to fix or manage someone else's behavior, because you understand that it's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to yourself, your clarity, your boundaries, and your emotional equilibrium. The beauty of this approach is that it disarms manipulators without confrontation. When someone realizes that their attempts to provoke an emotional response fail, they lose interest, because the thrill of control depends entirely on your engagement. You no longer provide that engagement, and suddenly their manipulative behaviors lose all meaning. The emotional tug-of-war ends, because you are no longer participating in it. It's a quiet power, subtle but far more effective than any reactive argument or confrontation. It's the kind of power that transforms the dynamic entirely, leaving you in full control of your choices and your emotional state. Practicing detachment doesn't happen overnight. It requires awareness, discipline, and self-trust. It requires the courage to step back and observe, rather than immediately respond. It requires the commitment to prioritize your mental and emotional well-being over someone else's desire for control, and the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. You begin to move through relationships, conversations, and even conflicts with a calm, grounded energy that cannot be shaken by manipulation, uncertainty, or subtle tactics. The moment you fully embrace emotional detachment, you also begin to cultivate resilience. You are no longer dependent on external validation or approval because your sense of self is anchored internally. You are no longer reacting to every emotional trigger because you have created a buffer between action and response. You start to experience freedom, not in the sense of escaping the other person's influence entirely, because that may not always be possible, but in the sense of reclaiming control over your own emotional world. You begin to understand that no one else's behavior has the power to define your value or dictate your actions, unless you allow it, and that is a level of autonomy and empowerment that fundamentally changes the way you navigate life. One of the most important things to understand about manipulation is that it only works when you participate. Their influence exists because you allow it to, consciously or unconsciously. The moment you realize this, you step into a space of immense personal power. It's not about confronting someone else, or trying to prove that you are stronger than them, or even about winning an argument. It's about recognizing that their ability to affect you is contingent entirely on your willingness to engage. And once you understand that, the dynamic changes completely. People who thrive on controlling others often rely on subtle, consistent engagement. They depend on you caring enough to notice, to analyze, to respond. The more invested you are in their words, their approval, or their mood swings, the more control they have. If you're constantly trying to decode their intentions, interpret their signals, or anticipate their reactions, they have you exactly where they want you, emotionally tethered. But here's the liberating truth. The moment you choose not to play, the moment you step back from that engagement, their power evaporates. It's not a dramatic moment, it's quiet, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it is profoundly transformative. Understanding this requires you to confront a very human tendency, the desire to fix things, to maintain relationships, to preserve harmony. You have been conditioned to seek connection, to avoid conflict, and to ensure that others perceive you positively. And manipulators exploit that instinct ruthlessly. They rely on the fact that you will invest emotional energy into trying to manage their behavior or reconcile their contradictions. But the irony is that none of that energy is necessary. The more you disengage, the more autonomous you become, and the less they can influence you. Detachment and awareness combine to create an almost magnetic form of strength. When you stop reacting to attempts at manipulation, you no longer validate their tactics. Their confusion, guilt-tripping, subtle criticisms, or mixed messages no longer hold weight. You see the pattern for what it is, an attempt to pull you into their world, to elicit a reaction, to remind you that they still matter. And when you refuse to engage,
When you no longer internalize their behavior or allow it to dictate your emotions, you become untouchable. Your independence becomes obvious, not only to yourself, but to them as well, and that is a profound shift in the power dynamic.
It's important to understand that disengaging is not about becoming indifferent or uncaring. It's about prioritizing your own mental and emotional space over someone else's need to control or influence you. You can be compassionate, considerate, and respectful without letting someone's attempts at manipulation dictate your feelings or decisions. You can maintain boundaries without explanation or justification. You can respond with clarity and calm rather than reacting out of instinct. This is where true power lies. Quiet, deliberate, and self-owned, rather than noisy, reactive, or externally dependent. When you stop participating in manipulation, you also stop perpetuating the cycle. Most manipulators rely on feedback loops, a reaction, an emotional spike, a moment of confusion or guilt from you, feeds the behavior, encourages it, and reinforces their sense of control. But once you withdraw from that loop, their strategies fail. They can no longer measure success by your responses because there are none to measure, and that is when the dynamic fundamentally changes. They are left to confront the reality that you are no longer a participant in their attempts to influence your life. Another crucial aspect is the way disengagement enhances clarity. When you are no longer invested in decoding someone else's behavior or interpreting their motives, you gain mental and emotional space. You start to see the reality of the relationship more clearly. You recognize patterns, see motivations, and understand boundaries without distortion. You no longer filter your perception through the lens of their behavior or their attempts at control. Instead, you observe objectively, and that objectivity gives you the ability to make decisions that are aligned entirely with your own values, goals, and priorities. This understanding also impacts the way you approach other relationships. When you internalize that manipulation only works when you participate, you gain insight into human behavior at large. You begin to notice the difference between influence and control, between guidance and coercion, between healthy relational dynamics and toxic patterns. You develop the ability to engage authentically with people who respect your autonomy, while distancing yourself from those who attempt to dominate or destabilize your sense of self. This discernment is invaluable because it allows you to create a life structured around your own principles rather than the demands of others. The moment you accept that their influence depends on your participation, you also embrace responsibility for your own power. You no longer rely on someone else's approval to feel validated. You no longer invest emotional energy in trying to manage their behavior or reconcile their inconsistencies. You stop seeking permission to exist as your authentic self. That energy, once devoted to navigating their manipulation, is now fully yours. You can direct it toward your growth, your goals, and your own sense of fulfillment, rather than surrendering it to someone else's attempts to control or influence you. Finally, this realization cultivates a sense of freedom that is unmatched. You are no longer a player in a game that was never yours to begin with. You can observe the tactics, recognize the intentions, and choose your response, or choose no response at all. The less you participate, the more autonomous and empowered you become, and the more your life unfolds according to your own design rather than someone else's manipulation. The truth is, the moment you truly internalize that their power relies entirely on your engagement, you become untouchable in ways that are both quiet and profoundly transformative. Boundaries and self-worth are not just concepts, they are the armor you wear in the face of manipulation. Many people underestimate just how powerful these two elements are, but the truth is, they form the foundation of emotional independence. When you truly understand and commit to your boundaries, when you recognize the inherent value you carry, you create a space where others cannot exert undue influence over you. Boundaries are not walls, they are declarations of what is acceptable and what is not, and self-worth is the recognition that your time, energy, and emotions are precious and not up for negotiation. People who are accustomed to controlling others often rely on the ambiguity of boundaries. They test limits, push buttons, and see how far they can stretch the elasticity of your patience or compliance. And if your sense of self-worth is fragile, if it wavers depending on their approval, these manipulations find fertile ground. You may begin to rationalize their behavior, minimize their impact, or feel guilty for asserting yourself. But the moment you anchor yourself in clarity about what you deserve and refuse to compromise on your values, the dynamic shifts dramatically. Your boundaries become non-negotiable, and your self-worth becomes an unshakable shield. Establishing boundaries requires courage, particularly with people who have relied on your compliance in the past. It's not just about saying no to overt requests, it's about asserting your right to emotional, mental, and physical space. It's about recognizing when behavior is manipulative or disrespectful, and taking deliberate action to prevent it from affecting you. This may mean disengaging from arguments that are designed to provoke, refusing to participate in guilt-driven interactions, or limiting your exposure to toxic patterns entirely. Every boundary you assert sends a clear message: your autonomy is not up for negotiation. Self-worth amplifies the power of boundaries. When you truly value yourself, you no longer seek validation from those who have attempted to undermine it. You don't internalize their tactics or allow their opinions to define your reality. Instead, you approach interactions from a place of confidence, knowing that your needs, feelings, and choices are valid simply because you exist. This combination of self-respect and clear boundaries makes you far less susceptible to manipulation, because it communicates that you cannot be shaken or redirected by attempts to instill doubt, guilt, or fear. One of the most profound effects of boundaries and self-worth is the ability to respond rather than react. Manipulators rely on impulsive responses because emotional reactions are predictable and exploitable. But when your sense of value is intact and your boundaries are firm, you create a buffer between action and response. You can observe behavior without absorbing it, assess intentions without succumbing to pressure, and choose your course of action with intention rather than instinct. This is where true emotional sovereignty emerges, and it is one of the most effective ways to neutralize the influence of someone who is accustomed to control. Boundaries also serve as a tool for clarity in relationships. They define what is acceptable and what is not, allowing you to maintain healthy interactions while eliminating unnecessary stress. They communicate respect for yourself and set expectations for how others must engage with you. This is not about rigidity or inflexibility. It is about creating a framework in which you can operate confidently and without compromise to your emotional health. When your boundaries are respected, interactions become mutually beneficial, and when they are tested, you have the power to disengage without self-doubt or guilt. Self-worth, in turn, reinforces resilience. When you understand that your value is inherent and not contingent on someone else's approval, criticism loses its sting. Manipulative attempts to provoke, belittle, or guilt you no longer carry the weight they once might have. You develop a natural immunity to tactics designed to destabilize your confidence, because you operate from a foundation that is independent of external validation. This internal anchoring is what allows you to remain composed, strategic, and unwavering in the face of manipulative behaviors. Together, boundaries and self-worth transform the power dynamic. Where once control was external, it becomes internal. You define your interactions, your responses, and your emotional investment. You no longer react to attempts at manipulation because your internal compass guides you. Every boundary asserted and every affirmation of your value chips away at the influence of anyone attempting to control you. This combination creates a profound sense of empowerment, one that is quiet, consistent, and unshakable. Ultimately, when you cultivate both boundaries and self-worth, you create an environment where manipulation cannot thrive. Your autonomy becomes evident, your value undeniable, and your confidence unassailable. The tactics designed to destabilize you lose all effectiveness, and you navigate relationships and challenges from a position of strength, clarity, and self-possession. Reclaiming your freedom is the ultimate act of power. It's the moment when you step fully into yourself and realize that no one else has the authority to dictate your emotions, your decisions, or your worth. Freedom is not simply the absence of someone else's control, it is the presence of your own clarity, self-respect, and boundaries. It's about choosing to live a life on your terms, where your choices are guided by your values rather than someone else's manipulation. This is the kind of freedom that transforms every interaction and every relationship, because it changes the way you occupy space in the world. When someone has tried to control you, regaining freedom is not always easy. Their influence can linger in your mind, creating doubt or triggering old patterns of behavior. But the key is to recognize that your freedom exists independently of their actions. It's internal, rooted in your self-awareness and emotional sovereignty. The moment you consciously reclaim it, you begin to navigate life with a sense of purpose and confidence that cannot be undermined by others' attempts to destabilize you. You no longer wait for permission to act, approval to feel valid, or validation to exist fully. You are the author of your own story, and that is a level of empowerment that cannot be taken away. Reclaiming freedom also involves the courage to set boundaries unapologetically. It's about recognizing what behavior you will tolerate and what you will not, and acting accordingly without hesitation or guilt. Every boundary you enforce, every line you draw, reinforces your autonomy and sends a clear message: your life is yours, not a stage for someone else's control. And when you combine these boundaries with an unwavering sense of self-worth, the result is profound. You no longer need to explain or justify your decisions because your inner compass is your guide. You no longer seek approval from those who wish to manipulate you, and that clarity transforms the way you interact with the world. One of the most empowering aspects of reclaiming freedom is the ability to choose engagement deliberately. You no longer react impulsively to attempts at manipulation or emotional provocation. You observe, assess, and decide how, or if you want to participate. This ability to respond rather than react is a hallmark of emotional mastery, and it fundamentally shifts the dynamic with anyone who has tried to control you. Their tactics lose effectiveness because you are no longer an emotional participant in their game. Your energy, attention, and focus are yours alone, and that autonomy is both liberating and transformative. Reclaiming freedom also means embracing your own growth and potential without interference. You are free to pursue your goals, your passions, and your relationships without being tethered to someone else's insecurities or expectations. This is where true empowerment emerges, in the ability to live a life aligned with your values, your desires, and your ambitions, independent of manipulation or external control. Every step you take in this direction strengthens your sense of agency and reinforces the reality that no one else has the power to define your worth or dictate your happiness. Ultimately, reclaiming freedom is not an act of defiance, it is an act of self-ownership. It is the conscious decision to live on your terms, to maintain your emotional integrity, and to honor your boundaries and your value. When you embrace this freedom fully, manipulation loses all its power. You navigate life with clarity, confidence, and unshakable self-respect, and the world opens up with opportunities and possibilities that were previously obscured by the influence of someone else's control. The journey through recognizing manipulation, detaching emotionally, refusing to participate, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming freedom is not just about handling one person, it's about transforming the way you engage with the world. Each step builds on the last, creating a life where your choices, your emotions, and your worth are yours alone. When you stop giving your energy to someone else's control, when you anchor yourself in clarity, self-respect, and boundaries, you move from reaction to intention, from doubt to confidence, from limitation to liberation. This is the power of owning your autonomy. No one can destabilize you, no one can dictate your value, and no one can define your story except you. The moment you fully embrace that, you step into a life of empowerment, clarity, and unstoppable freedom.